Legends of Greek Mythology, The Story of Theseus, Part 2, The Slaying of the Minotaur. When the children of the tribute arrived at Crete, Theseus informed King Minos that he meant to kill the Minotaur. King Minos told the prince that if he could perform this task, he and all his companions might go free, and that nothing more should ever be said about the tribute. The truth is, this horrible Minotaur was not altogether a pleasant pet to keep, for there was always the possibility that he might get out of the labyrinth and do no end of damage. Therefore, King Minos would really have been very glad to get rid of him. Nevertheless, he was so hard-hearted that he would not permit Theseus to go armed to meet the monster. Hence, there was very little hope of the hero's success. That night, the young Athenians were thrown into a dungeon under the palace of King Minos, one of them being destined for the Minotaur's breakfast in the morning. Directly over this dungeon were the rooms of the two daughters of King Minos, Ariadne and Phaedra. As the two sisters stood on the wall enjoying the moonlight, they heard the complaining of the captives. "What a pity it is," said Ariadne, "that these youths and maidens should become food for the Minotaur. I pity young Prince Theseus most of all, because he is so brave. If you are willing, we will help him to slay the Minotaur." Phaedra was as eager as Ariadne to help the young prince, so the two made a plan that they thought might succeed. They waited till all the king's household were asleep, then stole softly to the dungeon and opened the door. Worn out with fatigue and anxiety, all the captives but Theseus had fallen asleep. Theseus, however, was wide awake. Ariadne beckoned to him to come out. Then she and Phaedra took him to the place where the famous labyrinth stood. Its white marble walls looked very high and strong in the moonlight. The night was very still, save for the lapping of the waves on the shore, and Theseus could distinctly hear the heavy breathing of the sleeping Minotaur. "This is the best time to attack the creature. Do not wait until morning," Ariadne whispered, and Theseus knew that she was right. "The Minotaur's den is in the very heart of the labyrinth," Ariadne continued. "The sound of his breathing will show you in what direction you must go. Here is a sword, and here is a clue of thread, by means of which, after you have killed the monster, you can find your way back." With these words, she handed him the sword and the clue or ball of thread, of which she kept the end in her own hand, and opened for him a door leading by a secret passage into the labyrinth. Theseus, holding the sword in one hand and the clue in the other, entered the labyrinth. The interior was all cut up into narrow paths bordered by high walls. So many of these paths ended in a blank wall that Theseus often had to retrace his steps. There never was another labyrinth half so intricate as this one, which was made by the famous Daedalus. Back and forth, in and out, Theseus went. He could hear the heavy breathing more and more plainly, and knew that he was getting nearer to the den of the monster he was seeking. Meanwhile, Ariadne and Phaedra stood at the gate, Ariadne holding her end of the thread. They waited a long time. They could not tell how long. The moon set behind the hills and left only the light of the stars. Then they heard a great roar that shook the strong walls of the labyrinth. After this, everything was still again. It was hard for Ariadne to wait now, for she did not know, but Theseus might be lying dead inside, or if he had not been killed by the Minotaur, might have dropped the thread in the fight, and so be lost in the maze of paths. At last she felt the thread tighten, and in a moment more out Theseus came, saying that he had slain the Minotaur. Fortunately, the galley that had brought Theseus and his companions to Crete was still lying on the shore. This made it possible to escape from King Minos before daylight. The sleeping youths and maidens in the dungeon were quickly roused, the little ship was launched, and all were soon ready to set out for Athens. Before going aboard, Theseus asked the daughters of King Minos to go with his companions and himself to Athens. "Your father, the king, will be angry," said he, "when he knows how you have aided me. This will be the best way to escape his wrath." Having good reason to fear the cruelty of King Minos, the two princesses accepted this invitation. On their way to Athens, the young people stopped at the island of Naxos. Here, the young men, exhausted from hard rowing and greatly in need of rest, pulled the galley up on the shore, where the whole company encamped on the bare rocks for the night. Very early the next morning they set sail and started off again, but Ariadne, being fast asleep on a rock, was left behind. End of Part 2.